The Supreme Court just dropped a unanimous emergency ruling, and it has completely shaken the nation. Not 6-3, not 5-4, 9-0. Every single justice agreed. And when that happens, it doesn't just send a message. It sends a shockwave through every courtroom, every state capital, and every federal agency in the country. This isn't just another legal case. This one carries massive nationwide implications. And depending on how it's interpreted and applied in the months ahead, it could fundamentally change the balance of power between the states and the federal government in ways we haven't seen in decades. We need to break down exactly what the court ruled, what it means on the ground, and why legal experts on both sides are already calling this one of the most consequential emergency decisions in modern American history. Now, real quick before we jump in, looking at the analytics, about 60% of viewers who regularly watch these videos aren't actually subscribed. If you find value in these breakdowns and you want this kind of critical legal news to reach more people, please take a second and hit that subscribe button. It's free. It helps tremendously with the algorithm, and it ensures you never miss when the Supreme Court makes another major move like this one. All right, let's get into it. Here's what just happened. The Supreme Court, in a stunning 9-0 decision, issued an emergency order that is already creating serious tension between multiple states and the federal government, specifically the Department of Justice. And when the court rules unanimously, that's not a political split. That's a constitutional verdict. Every justice, conservative and liberal, looked at this situation and said the same thing. Enough. This ruling involves a major federal enforcement issue that could reshape how far Washington can go when it comes to blocking or overriding state-level laws. And just like we saw in the Texas border dispute, the core of this fight centers on the limits of federal power versus state sovereignty. But this time, the case reached the Supreme Court faster than almost anyone expected, and the unanimous result left very little room for interpretation. The court's 9-0 emergency decision effectively sided with the states, saying that the federal government may have significantly overstepped its authority by seeking broad nationwide injunctions, court orders that freeze entire state laws before they even fully take effect. That might sound technical, but trust me, it's a very big deal. What the Supreme Court just signaled is that the federal government cannot simply use the courts as a weapon to shut down a state law across the entire country before it's even been properly challenged. Let's unpack what led to this and what the ruling actually said. A few weeks ago, multiple states filed lawsuits challenging what they argued was clear federal overreach. They said that certain actions by federal agencies, especially under emergency orders, were bypassing both Congress and the courts, and were effectively rewriting state laws without any legislative approval whatsoever. The lower courts responded by granting nationwide injunctions, blocking those state laws entirely. But that's exactly the kind of judicial overreach the Supreme Court has now taken direct aim at. In this 9-0 emergency decision, the court emphasized that lower courts do not have the authority to issue sweeping nationwide blocks when the issue only directly affects specific plaintiffs. In simple terms, the Supreme Court is saying, enough with the universal injunctions. Federal judges cannot hit pause on entire state laws that apply to millions of people simply because a handful of plaintiffs filed a lawsuit. This echoes what the court said earlier this year in Labrador versus Poe, which placed similar limits on lower court power. But this latest order goes even further, applying those principles in real time and sending a crystal clear warning to lower courts that the era of nationwide injunctions may be coming to a permanent end. Now, as soon as the ruling dropped, the response was immediate and intense. State officials across the country are calling it a major victory for federalism and state self-governance. Meanwhile, officials inside the DOJ are privately describing it as a legal earthquake. And that term, earthquake, is exactly right, because this ruling could directly affect dozens of ongoing cases, from immigration enforcement and gun regulations to election oversight and environmental rules. Let's look at a specific example. Under this new interpretation, if a state passes a controversial law, say on border security or firearm policy, A single federal judge can no longer freeze that law across the entire country. Instead, any court relief would be limited only to the specific parties involved in that particular lawsuit. That is a massive shift in how federal litigation works. It means states now have far more breathing room to enforce their laws, even while those laws are being challenged in court. And the fact that the Supreme Court issued this as an emergency ruling, not a full opinion after months of oral arguments, shows just how urgent the justices viewed the problem. Here's where it gets even more significant. In a concurring opinion, Justice Gorsuch emphasized that injunctions should only go as far as necessary to protect the actual plaintiffs, not to rewrite the rules for the entire country. He wrote that courts must return to the traditional limits of equitable relief and stop acting like, in his words, mini legislators. That line is striking. It's a direct rebuke to the pattern of lower courts issuing broad national rulings that function more like policy decisions than judicial ones. And here's the most important part. Even the liberal justices agreed. This was not a 5-4 partisan split. This was 9 justices across every ideological corner of that court sending a unified message. When that happens, the legal world pays attention, because a unanimous ruling carries an authority that a divided one simply cannot match. Now, here's the political fallout. Almost immediately after the ruling, the White House and the DOJ released carefully worded statements saying they were reviewing the court's order. Translation, they know this changes the playing field entirely. And just like we saw in the Texas border case, states are wasting no time invoking this new Supreme Court precedent to strengthen their legal positions. Attorneys general from multiple states have already filed supplemental briefs citing this decision as direct support for their claims against federal overreach. In one of those filings, state lawyers explicitly argued that the Supreme Court has reaffirmed that states retain the right to defend their sovereignty without being subjected to blanket injunctions from unelected judges. That line sums up exactly what's at stake here. Power. Who gets to decide what's enforced, where, and by whom? The states or Washington, D.C.? Legally speaking, the implications are staggering. This ruling will restrict federal agencies from using the courts as a tool to block state laws in their entirety. Instead, agencies will need to pursue narrower relief, meaning that major policy disputes will need to be resolved politically, not judicially. In other words, the Supreme Court just told the lower courts, stay in your lane. And here's why that matters to every single American, regardless of where you stand politically. For years, both Democrats and Republicans have used federal courts to push nationwide outcomes when they couldn't get their way through legislation. This ruling effectively cuts off that shortcut. If you want sweeping national change, you'll now need to win it through Congress or through elections, not through a single federal judge's order. Now, a lot of you are asking, what happens next? Because this was an emergency order, it doesn't close the door on future litigation. It sets a binding precedent that lower courts must follow going forward. The underlying cases will likely return to the appellate level, where judges will now be required to apply this far narrower framework. And make no mistake, this fight is far from over. The federal government will challenge this interpretation in other cases, hoping to carve out exceptions where they argue national interest demands broader relief. But the Supreme Court's message, delivered unanimously, was crystal clear. The Constitution does not allow judges to govern an entire nation from their courtroom. Stepping back, what makes this decision so historically significant is the context. The court has been steadily building toward this moment for years, pushing back against judicial overreach and reasserting the separation of powers. A unanimous ruling like this one accelerates that trajectory dramatically. This is a decision that will be studied, debated, and cited in American courtrooms for decades to come. And right now, you're watching it happen in real time.